I don't want us to say, okay, there's debates and dialogues. If it's a dialogue, you never try to persuade. I reject that. Welcome back to Apologist Reacts. I'm Josh Brahm. I am a pro-life apologist. I try to help people to have good conversations about abortion, and I'm going to watch some more video footage of people actually talking about abortion. So this video, I haven't seen it before, but it looks like it's a compilation of conversations of people talking about abortion in the news around the 90s. And so I have no idea what this is going to be like, but let's take a look.
It was a deadly act of violence that brought the unlikely group together. On December 30th, 1994, John Salvi went on a shooting rampage at 2 Brookline abortion clinics. 2 women died. Several others were injured.
Okay, so should go without saying, but I'm just going to say it here, completely against abortion-related violence. This is really wrong. I understand why there were some people who were, so passionate about this that they felt like this was the right thing to do, but they are thinking really badly morally. Yes, pro-life people believe that abortion kills babies, but that does not give us the right to go trying to kill people to protect them. I have an article I'll link to in the description where I talked about that a bit. There's like this theory of like, what if someone were to kidnap temporarily, women who wanted to have abortions? Like, could you pick them up as if you were like an Uber and try to convince them not to have an abortion on that trip and not take them to the abortion clinic? So like, even in that case, I'm like, no, this is really, you can't do that. Not that anyone ever has. I think it was just kind of like someone was like saying that. But I talked about how both at a pragmatic level, it sets the pro-life movement back every time some kind of abortion-related violence happens. And there hasn't been nearly as much lately as there was in the 80s and 90s, which is a good thing. But also, even at a principled level, we don't live in a death spot. There are other things that the pro-life movement can be doing to try to change people's minds about abortion or convince people not to have abortions, and therefore that is what we ought to do. So this is really wrong. I think it's tragic. It bothers me to just think of this happening. It's just wrong.
Pro-choice activists were terrified the violence would continue. In the chaotic aftermath, their anger was aimed at pro-life organizations.
I thought they were the enemy, and I saw them as the enemy.
I mean, that makes sense, especially if you work at an abortion clinic and like what you're seeing on the news is that there are anti-abortion people committing violence. Like, naturally, of course you would feel like they're the enemies.
And it was nearly impossible for me to be, I felt viscerally angry when I would be around them.
Pro-life activists were horrified by the incident, but also concerned that their cause would be connected with the violence. That concern prevented them from reaching out. Frances Hogan, president of Women Affirming Life, remembers the night of the shooting as she sat next to Planned Parenthood President Nikki Nichols Gamble as they both waited to appear on a television newscast.
And I sat there, and I never said a word to Nikki. I never said I'm sorry, even though I felt it from the depth of my being. I never said I'm sorry to Nikki about what had happened. I just went into my shell because that's where I was at that moment. Even though as a human person, any other situation, I would have gone over and put my arms around Nikki.
It was amidst this tense.
That's really interesting. Good for her for saying that, for talking openly about that. It is really important for us to try to get outside of that shell if we can. Of course, she wouldn't have supported that violence, but it's so important for pro-choice people who might not know better to understand that like 99% of pro-lifers are very, very against anything like that. And we need to be clear about that. It's like one of the only things that you will see like will make every pro-life organization basically release a statement is if some kind of abortion-related violence happens. Because we want to be clear, we are not okay with this. We're not supporting it. It's not part of what we do. We have, and most pro-life groups have, some kind of a nonviolent statement. Like, it's in the footer of our website. Like, you can't miss it on any page of our website because we want that to be really clear. There are a lot of reasons to be opposed to abortion-related violence, but I've had those moments, before doing a thing. I remember doing a debate with a woman from NRL. I think it was NRL, Georgia. I was going to do a radio debate, and we hung out in a green room at this radio station for, I don't know, at least a half an hour before we got started. We had a really nice conversation. It was really a lot of common ground. We talked about, the issues, in the foster care system, and I think they were even a little bit annoyed because they had been like advertising this thing as like the great abortion debate. We came on kind of liking each other and we're nice and like even kind of like complimentary to each other, like during the commercial breaks and stuff. Like we still had a debate, but it wasn't, this kind of big dramatic thing that I think the radio station or the show was hoping it would be, because we had connected. We'd never met before. We never knew each other before, but we connected. And that should happen more often between pro-life and pro-choice people.
Tense atmosphere that the Boston-based Public Conversations Project began consulting community leaders about starting a dialogue on abortion. The project invited the 6 women to meet confidentially as individuals. What began as a series of 4 meetings turned into 150 hours of conversation over a 5.5-year period.
Wow, I've never heard of that before. That's super interesting. I love that it started private, because at first it's kind of like, it seems like this is a press conference. Like this is like these people were brought together to do like a joint press conference or something. But no, the fact that they spent so much time having private conversations, that is awesome. And the fact that it was private obviously made those conversations better, because you can feel safer, able to be more transparent in a conversation like that. If you're ever having a conversation with someone about abortion, try to do that in private, not like in a public Facebook debate thread or something like that, where people are kind of more just kind of thinking about their image, thinking about how the way that they come across, and are going to be less likely to concede any ground because they don't want like their own side to be miffed about that, like that kind of thing. 150, that's great. That's really interesting.
Fran, when you walked into those meetings, but in the meetings, did you feel like they blame us for this sort of thing, for this violence?
I don't think that I thought that Nikki blamed us, but I felt that in the community at large, there was a concern that the pro-life movement, through its rhetoric, had fostered an atmosphere where this could happen. And of course, to me, that was antithetical to everything that pro-life movement stood for. So it was very important to sit down with people from the other side and to try and lower the rhetoric and get the message out that people can talk in a civil way in the wider community.
I feel like that's a really fair statement from her. Good for her. I've never met this woman, but I feel like that's pretty fair, because there are a lot of times just any kind of politically active group has an opportunity to use a situation to their advantage. Often they will. I think that happens sometimes on both sides of the abortion debate, frankly, and it always kind of rubs me the wrong way. But certainly, I don't think it would be hard for me to find statements from pro-choice groups basically saying exactly what she's saying and making people feel like, even if it wasn't National Right to Life themselves setting up some clinic bombing or something like that, but they could be like, but the rhetoric of National Right to Life causes, people to get all inflamed. And then, of course, this kind of thing happens. And then it's definitely harder to talk about the issue. And so certainly the way that we talk about the issue should be in a way that wouldn't inflame people. I feel like, anyone who goes to one of my speeches or goes through the Equip for Life course is going to come out of it at least less likely to do something like that, more understanding of the other side, more seeing them as persons, and wanting to have conversations that are not just logical, but also, gracious and charitable and conversational and open-minded. And so certainly there are groups that could probably do a better job with the kind of language that they use at not, overly inflaming people. And definitely I hope that we never do that here at ERI.
I had no idea what to expect. I didn't know what I would learn. I didn't have any idea what was going to come out of this, but I felt as a pro-choice leader, given what we were facing in our community, that I needed to try something.
Here we were, public leaders on this issue, but yet we had never had a personal conversation. And so that you only saw the person through what you saw on the TV screen. It was a bit intimidating, and that it was going to be tough. I think the biggest thing in the
That's common. I've said that before. It's common to feel intimidated when you're going to, talk to people on the other side. There's a lot of reasons for that, but just know that is normal. It's not something wrong with you. If you're feeling intimidated about talking to someone on the other side, it can feel intimidating. The more that you do it, the less intimidating it feels, typically speaking. But yeah, that's normal.
In the early part of our dialogue was just coming to terms on the language. How are we even going to talk to each other?
Oh, that's super interesting. Okay, so we talk about that a lot. Talk about the language. In fact, this is an area where I think actually a lot of times pro-life people get kind of annoyed with me. Not kind of, like this is just true. Like I will get emails from people disagreeing or all, YouTube comments or whatever from pro-lifers not liking something I've done. And I think probably, if I have to like put them all in categories, and the top 5 easily would have to do with language. Probably the top 2 would have to do with the language that I use, labels that I use. Why don't you say pro-choice? Why do you say pro-choice instead of pro-abortion or pro-abort or, anti-life or something like that? And I just think that's super unhelpful. I don't think that most people who identify as pro-choice would feel like they're being accurately labeled if they were called pro-abortion, because they typically are not for abortion. They're for the choice to have an abortion. No label is perfect. There are issues with every label. There are issues with the label pro-choice and issues with the label pro-life. There are, pro-lifers don't want to be called anti-choice. That feels very, leading in a negative way. And I just kind of want to like err on the side of using extra neutral labels so that we can be talking about the real issues, the real things that we disagree on, like philosophically speaking, and not get caught up on the language. So it makes sense to me that this group of people would need some time to kind of figure out like how do we talk to each other when, if one group, let's say, is always wanting to use the term baby murder instead of abortion, for example. Like, it's going to make it hard to have the conversation. You understand, if you're in the other side's shoes, and if the other side is always wanting to, call you anti-choice fanatics instead of pro-life advocates. Like, it's just going to it adds a lot of tension and just constant reminders of the things that we disagree on or how far apart we are in certain ways. No, focus on the commonalities that you have, and then you can more easily talk about the areas where you disagree, which you should do. I'm not trying to get people to only talk about the common ground they have. It's important. It's, arguably a necessary condition to having a really good dialogue, but you're going to need to talk about the things that you disagree on too.
We decided that in order to show respect for each other, that we ought to call the other what that person wants to be called.
Good.
And that's what we've tried to do. And it isn't easy for all of us to do that, but we agreed to do that for the sake of proceeding with the discussion.
We all were so anxious, I think, to talk with one another and to really go for a deeper understanding. What was behind the words? What did the other person really believe? What led them to their beliefs? That I think we found we had to let go of some of the language piece of it just to have the conversation. Mm-hmm. And it didn't mean that our views changed at all, but we need to make, within the dialogue per se, we needed to make some adjustment in language.
What do you know now about the other side that you didn't know then?
The unbelievable value of having conversations with one another to my life, as well as me as a leader, has been very profound. Mm-hmm. So I think it's really the juxtaposition of this issue is not going away, and also the importance of being able to have conversations with one another at the same time.
So I really appreciate where she's coming from here, and I love what she's saying, that it is profound and important to have these conversations. I wish that her answer had been deeper there, though, because the question was, how has this changed you? And kind of her answer in the end was, it has changed me, and it was important. I would have loved to hear her talk more. Maybe she will during this video talk more about how it's changed her. What has this done for her? Has this affected the way that you think about the pro-life movement, or at least these leaders of the pro-life movement? And same for the other side. This is different than the last kind of Reacts video I did, because this is an interview, kind of a news interview that they're doing about the conversations that they've had. So there's less for me to react to as far as the actual conversation. I wish I had a chance to actually watch some of the private dialogues. I mean, I know that was the whole point, was that they're having the dialogues privately, but I would love to have been able to see what those conversations were like and be able to do a React video to those. But I'm guessing that footage doesn't exist.
The things I read that I thought you must have all had a really hard time with is not being an advocate in this conversation. I mean, this is what you all do, right? I mean,
I had a real hard time with that, Margie. Our agreement was not to try to persuade the other person, but I am so convicted in my own beliefs that I hoped that what I said, which I believe to be the truth, itself would convince the other person. What we found out.
The difference was we were not in debate. Mm-hmm. This was very different. That in debate, you are anticipating, as the other person is speaking, You're anticipating how you're going to respond. And in the dialogue, you do just the opposite. You have to listen, and then what you don't fully understand, you have to ask another question. It isn't so that the goal is to understand the other person's point of view, not to press your own in that particular moment.
All right.
So that's interesting. There's a part of that that I really like, and there's a part of it that I don't know how much I like. She's doing a great job of explaining the difference between debate and dialogue. This is fantastic. She's doing great. That is exactly right. We try to teach people how to dialogue, not debate. And her talking about the importance of listening and then asking follow-up questions, we teach that all the time at Equal Rights Institute. However, where I think we might be different is that we do still think it's okay for people to try to persuade each other. Maybe there's a reason in their case for their meetings, at least for a while, to not be about persuasion, but to just be about coming together, finding common ground, getting to know each other. But at some point, once you've done that and you've built up a lot of rapport and trust, why not try to convince each other? You know, not in a debatey kind of a way where it's like, you know, I'm just thinking about your next argument. I'm getting, you know, it's this rat-a-tat-tat kind of thing. But you can do dialogues and listening and finding common ground and also try to persuade the other person with, you know, occasionally making a good argument. And so when I have dialogues, I will do a lot of listening. I will ask a lot of clarification questions, but at some point, I'm also going to make my argument. I'm going to say, okay, so here's what I hear you saying. I'm going to describe it, make sure it's accurate. And then it's like, okay, so here's the thing that I'm struggling with is I have this thought that's different, and then I'll describe it and be as clear and transparent and authentic as I can. And then say, okay, so come back at me. Help me out here. You know, help me see what might be wrong with my view, kind of a thing. And then, you know, we're having this dialogue. And I might persuade them with that really good argument or a series of good arguments. Or they could persuade me, or they can help me see what's wrong with my argument. But at some point, I feel like I don't want us to say, okay, there's debates and dialogues. If it's a dialogue, you never try to persuade. I reject that. I think it's still okay to try to persuade people, even if it's not in the very beginning of the dialogue. But at some point, it's okay to try to say, okay, it seems like one of us is wrong. We can't both be right. Our views are too different. We might both be wrong, but we're at least not both right. Let's try to go on this journey toward finding more truth.
And so did you ever get angry at each other? Did you get...
Oh, we had some very fiery moments. Those conversations were the least interesting. What's interesting is to actually find out what it is we don't understand and to get into that place where I actually have found, you know, there's things that I'm actually curious about, how you come to that position and where you're coming from. And
well, I think the ground rule.
I think that's interesting how she said that the fiery moments were the least interesting. I think that's usually true. They might be interesting in the sense that it is revealing something about the person who is getting very angry or whatever. You know, they're having a moment. They're reacting to something. They're triggered by something. What's going on there? Why are they so upset? But at a content substance level, that's typically not going to be the most interesting things that get said during those fiery moments. A lot of times this is going to be a lot of anger and hurt. It doesn't mean we shouldn't talk about those things and process those things, but I think I understand why she's saying those were the least interesting elements compared to, you know, unexpected moments of common ground or whatever.
Rules really enabled us to have this conversation, and so if we had a particularly, I think, tough time talking about what pro-life people call a partial birth abortion, and we were pursuing that over many sessions, and it was painful. It was really painful going.
Is that something where you look at that and say, this might be a place that where we have common ground, where some people may say, that's okay, or that's not okay? No, everybody's shaking their heads no.
I think one of the things that we learned from this discussion was that there was no common ground. We went into it knowing that there was no common ground, there was no compromise.
So this is an all or nothing conversation.
No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm just saying is that we didn't attempt to reach common ground on the abortion issue, and that the conversation was more trying to find out what the other person believes. I think that's what we're doing.
It's disheartening that here's this.
I'm confused now. Wait, what? Like at first I thought, okay, maybe they're saying we just couldn't find common ground about partial birth abortion, which is actually, that even would be kind of surprising to me because most pro-choice people, you can find common ground with them about partial birth abortion, which is not a procedure that is done anymore. That was made illegal. The ban was upheld by the Supreme Court. So it's important for pro-life people to understand partial birth abortions don't happen anymore. If they do, they're happening on the down low or illegally, basically. Like that particular procedure was made illegal. But most pro-choice people agreed that shouldn't happen, especially if it's an elective thing. And that was a lot of the debate during the personal birth abortion ban, discussion was, the pro-choice side would say this only happens in medical emergencies with the woman. But then the pro-life side had evidence that there were at least some of them being done that were elective. I'll drop a link in the description or to Secular Pro-Life's blog. They had some good evidence that they had compiled. I remember also the man who had literally invented the procedure had talked about how a lot of the ones that he had done were elective procedures. So there's kind of this back and forth thing that would happen. But at least there was an area of common ground. You could usually find with the pro-choice persons that an elective abortion should not be a partial birth abortion. But it sounds like, in contrast, they're saying they were never able to find common ground about anything within this discussion, which is confusing to me. So it's okay, they went through all this process, they figured out language that they could use to try to keep the conversation going. But then what else happened? What happened for 150 hours of conversation that was neither attempts to persuade nor common ground? So I wonder if I'm just confused. I wonder if I am missing something, because it's hard to imagine that much discussion and there being no common ground.
This group, 6 very educated women who are willing to be civil, who are really willing to investigate, and still we're not able to find any common ground on this issue.
Well, I think what's heartening, as opposed to not heartening, is that we are still talking after 6 years.
Yeah, but about what? What is happening in this 6 years that is not common ground nor attempts to persuade? I don't understand right now what is happening in these conversations, besides just each person expressing what they feel about something, right? So you could have that. The pro-life person says, here's what I feel about partial birth abortion. And the pro-choice person says, well, here's what I feel about partial birth abortion. They could do that. No common ground has happened there. And you could argue no attempts to persuade if there's not a counter to the pro-life person's thing. That's what I think you're wrong about partial birth abortion because X. You could have that, but I don't know how interesting that is outside of the fact that the people were willing to get into the same room. I feel like I must be missing something if this has been going on for 6 years.
After confronting the deep chasm of this divide, that we can still confront it and respect one another. Mm-hmm. And we're still willing and interested and able to learn from one another. And
what are you learning from one another if there's no common ground? I guess learning new things? Man, I don't even know. I'm just confused.
And we still care about one another.
I have a lot of hope, actually.
So I'm glad for that. Okay, so I could see that you could build up a level of affection for someone on the other side just in virtue of spending time with them, getting to know who they are, that they are not, the wicked witch of the West or whatever, That's good. I imagine this had some kind of impact on how everyone maybe talked about the other side in public or whatever. I'm either missing something or these conversations could have been done a lot better. And I would have loved to have been part of a better version of what happened.
From my experience, I don't think it takes everybody 5 years to have this dialogue. Because we were leaders in our respective organizations, there was a lot at stake.
Yeah, I think we place, in these kinds of things, we're looking that the value would be that we found common ground or that there was agreement. But I think that there's something of even deeper value about the fact that people who are passionately divided on an issue that really has torn the country apart for over 25 years have been able to sustain a relationship, and not only sustain it, to grow in respect and concern and care for all of the participants across the divide. And I think that is a sign of hope. And I think we do need to continue to talk, and we can encourage the community to take up the conversation again. If they've stopped talking because they feel that they can't talk on this issue anymore, it's too painful.
Do you say?
Yeah, so I like that in the sense that, okay, this is a good example for people. Look, this is possible. Pro-life and pro-choice people, even if they are leaders of respective organizations that are they're activists, they're advocates, whatever, can get together and at least spend the time to get to know each other, to care for each other, to have conversations. I just wouldn't want it to stop there. I would want them to be able to get further and find some common ground, which maybe they just weren't trying hard enough at finding common ground, because I guarantee you there is common ground between these people. They just don't know it yet. And even then to go further than that and actually have a dialogue about why they disagree and maybe see if one side has a better argument than the other side.
Did it make you re-examine your fervently held beliefs?
You bet it did.
I think that's one of the things that came out of the dialogue, is the fact that each one of us experienced a re-examination of our own beliefs.
That's
and
good.
trying to find out why we believe what we believe, why we believe the law ought to be a certain way, and why the ethics ought to be a certain way. That was one of the enriching parts of the dialogue, I think, was looking at what you believed and re-examining it.
Any changes?
Well, I think one of the, maybe the most significant change is in terms of the tone of the debate. And I think as leaders we have a responsibility to set the tone. And as we have grown in that relationship with one another, and we watch, are very careful about language and what it means and the impact it can have.
Sort of the inflammatory language was immediately banned,
Yeah,
was
I
it
mean,
not?
inflammatory, but other kinds of less, I think, language that isn't even at that level. I think being particularly trying to be as accurate as possible, not making assumptions about what people believe or what they think.
That's
or
all
what's
good.
behind it, but going, as we have learned in the dialogue, to go for deeper understanding.
So that's good if the result of this is that everyone's like, okay, I've been making some false assumptions that I've discovered in the process of this conversation. They don't mean this maybe when they say certain things, or they don't believe these things, or they're not as mean as I thought. They don't actually hate babies, like whatever. And then be more careful about how you talk about it in public. I think that's great. Again, there could be more that happens, but good.
And I think that's very important, and we hope that the community will be engaged at that level and be willing to talk with one another.
I mean, I tended to think of people from the other side as not very smart, as not committed to women, as, I had terrible thoughts about them. And I have sure cleaned that part of my act up. I no longer believe that, and I'm certainly in all public situations, to be respectful of people's whose views are different than mine.
That's really interesting. I really appreciate that. That goes further than just saying this person's nicer than I thought. For a woman from Planned Parenthood to say, I have learned from these conversations that the pro-life side is not as dumb as I thought, or at least certain pro-life people are not as dumb as I thought, that there actually are smart people on the other side, is actually a really meaningful, that's the most meaningful thing that's probably been said in this entire video. And good for her for being willing to kind of acknowledge that to herself, but also to say that publicly. Good for her.
I have to, over the last 5 years, I think all of us have noticed in the public presentation of this issue by ourselves, we have changed our tone. I think we have. Certainly there will be disagreement among people about whether we should or shouldn't have done it. Both sides, I would assume. However, my personal view is that it was worth that risk to have the conversation go public, to have people within the wider community discussing this in a civil way, which is what we've tried to model. And so it was worth that risk, which I don't think is a tremendous risk, but it was worth the risk to try and take this public.
It's certainly not changed my passion for my side of it, but it has changed my understanding of how complex this discussion and this controversy is.
That's really good. I want both pro-life and pro-choice people to understand that. Like, one of the things I hope that they would get through our Equip for Life course, for example, is this is more complicated than you think. There are a lot of pro-life leaders who will basically call abortion a simple issue. I don't think it is. I think it's more complicated than a lot of people think, especially once you bring in the more complex bodily autonomy arguments. There are complexities to this debate, and let's not hide from that. Let's not run from that. Let's embrace that fact and rise to the challenge, kind of a thing. And so I think it's really good when pro-life and pro-choice people talk to each other and they kind of realize, oh, pro-life arguments were more complicated than I thought. Maybe I thought that they were all just like biblical arguments or something like that, or just like, your mom would have chosen life or whatever. This is like bad pro-life arguments versus, interesting kind of equality, equal rights-based arguments, like the equal rights argument that we teach. I will drop a link in the description to that. And same on the pro-choice side. They're not all just like, well, it's just like literally a part of the woman's body, like a kidney. Like, there's not that many pro-choice people making that argument, especially not anymore. I know it happens. Okay, don't tell me in the comments. I know there are people that will say silly things on both sides. It's just less often now, I think, than it used to be. And pro-choice and pro-life people are both getting better at making better arguments, generally speaking. And that is a good trend, which we can have better conversations if we're all making better arguments.
Now that we're going public, my hope is that people will be inspired by the fact that leaders of organizations have been having these conversations at this level. And who knows what this will unfold.
I think that's invaluable to really attempt to have a deeper understanding of the other person's views, even though we don't agree with them.
What this has been for me is an experience in exploring the depths and profundity of diversity. I used to fear these people, and it's been singularly rewarding and reassuring to know that we have this extraordinary difference, but also know that we're not going to shoot each other.
It was really an unbridgeable.
Definitely a very important thing for you to understand if you're going to have a good dialogue with the other side is that, yes, you guys aren't going to shoot each other.
Chasm, we found that. And there was only one thing that could bridge it, and that was love. And the love that we have come to develop for one another, in spite of the fact that we have such a huge divide among us, is to me almost a miracle.
I now believe that what held us together was faithfulness and human goodness and what we have learned to call love.
Wow. That's really interesting. I hope they continued to talk. I hope they were able to get even further into their conversations and find even more depth than was talked about in this kind of, set of interviews that they did in this video. And I just want to commend them for having been willing to do that, especially back then when the abortion topic was very, very divisive and intense because of all the violence that was going on, or at least in part because of all the violence that was going on. Things are really tense right now too, but I think it's for different reasons. There hasn't been a lot of abortion-related violence lately, which I'm very glad for, but I think there are other things going on in politics and just in culture right now where everyone is very, very divided about even much smaller issues than abortion, which is making conversations about everything very difficult for people to have. So I think that is the state of where things are right now. I think that means that our work is really, really important for people right now. And I also hope to see that trend differently. I hope that by 2022 or 2025, generally speaking, the temperature of political conversations has gone down some than what it has been certainly last year and the first half of this year. Well, that's all the time that I have today. Thanks for watching. Like the video, subscribe. If you enjoyed this, last time I actually reacted to an actual conversation that happened between pro-life and pro-choice people where they were brought into a room and given certain prompts and they actually have a dialogue with each other. I think that was really interesting. I would love to find more videos like that. So if you have any videos that you would like to see me respond to that show pro-life and pro-choice people talking to each other about abortion, feel free to post those in the comments. I don't really want to do any that are from some other pro-life organization. I don't want people to feel like I'm trying to tear anybody down or critique their dialogue tactics. But if there's just videos out there, just people having conversations, then that's the kind of thing that I would love to add to this series. And of course, if you would like to learn how to have better conversations about abortion, I highly recommend our online course that we made called Equipped for Life, a fresh approach to conversations about abortion. In that, we have 10 modules right now. We're continuing to expand it and even refilm some of them as we learn new techniques, new arguments that are helpful. But there are 10 modules right now. We go through habits of highly ineffective pro-life people. So we talk about being closed-minded and embracing confirmation bias and all these different things that people do that make the conversations worse. We talk about practical dialogue tips. Some of the things that I'll cover in series like this or the other Apologist Reacts videos I've done, we're just kind of talking about what are the little things that you can do to make conversations better. We talk about how to make an argument for the unborn based on equality as opposed to worse arguments for the pro-life position. We talk about how to respond to the question of rape with compassion, as well as taking a look at truth and being able to balance those things really, really carefully. We talk about bodily autonomy arguments, about utilitarianism, about how to talk to people who are thinking about having an abortion or perhaps are post-abortive. So all of that is in the Equipped for Life course. And if you use the discount code YouTube on checkout, you can get 10% off of any permanent membership level to the Equipped for Life course. You can get all that at equippedcourse.com. Thank you so much for watching. Now go have an important conversation.